All right, so let's move to our Patreon. My guest today is Reverend Brandan Robertson and Rev Brandan Robertson from TikTok. I really enjoyed your commentary on like what spirituality looks like in an agnostic fundamentalist Baptist evangelical. So would you say do you experience God? Do you hear God? Do you experience what does that experience of spirituality look like for you, if that's not too personal of a question?
Yeah, my spiritual life is all over the place right now. I think when I was pastoring my church mission gathering in San Diego, we were evangelical in form. We had a really great worship band up every Sunday. We were singing the normal stuff that they would be singing at the mega church down the road, maybe with some slightly different lyrics. And that environment, I still had kind of my deep emotional experiential connection to God in that environment. And most of my spirituality today probably looks like kind of basic contemplative practice of taking moments to become aware of where I'm at and of the beauty that is around me at every moment and perceiving God in and through that. And I think this version of spirituality where I'm at today is probably the most open I've ever been able to be now that I'm kind of outside of the role of being a institutionalized religious figure. So I'm really enjoying the ability to say, hey, if I want to dabble in this kind of spiritual practice, I can do that. And I'll wake up in the morning and oftentimes go walk to get my coffee and turn on my Hillsong album or gospel album and have my worship moment that way. And so I like the creativity. That's kind of the theme throughout my theology and spirituality is let's just be open, expressive, and down for whatever feels right in the moment as far as spiritual experience goes.
Very cool. I love all that stuff. And we were very closely affiliated with Bethel Church up in Redding, if you know, with them, and close friends with all of those guys and love them.
Yeah.
And honestly, this is makes me sad. I can't listen to the music anymore because the politics of it got so toxic and vile. And the things I heard come from the mouths of the leaders there, many of them involved in Bethel music, I just can't listen to it. It just robbed it from me a little bit. But I do think the contemplative stuff, and even I've been learning from a Buddhist friend of mine, is so much more in tune with mental well-being. And so I actually have found it to be a little more profitable from that perspective.
Yeah. And I think just the thing that people perceive it as cynical, it's not. There is a psychology behind all of this, and evangelicals can't acknowledge that. Bethel would never be able to admit it, but psychologists have written tomes on this, that what's being created in a Bethel environment is a mental emotional high. There's a release of serotonin that's being created in an environment. And I think we need to first say, that's not a bad thing. That's actually,
right.
God created this for us to experience. And this might be off-putting to some people, but I honestly have that experience now when I go to an EDM club, like I was out for Pride Weekend last week here at DC. And it's the same thing. And it's this beautiful moment for me of like, one, evangelicals don't know that they're doing this, but people have been doing this all over the place for hundreds of years. And there are spaces for folks like you and me who cannot probably go to a Hillsong or Bethel concert without having some PTSD. But there are other spaces where you can be stimulated in a way. And I find it not just to be this carnal experience when I'm on a dance floor, it's actually a deeply spiritual experience. And oftentimes those communities are less judgmental and frankly, more Christ-like than many of the evangelical churches. So I just want to encourage people. And as a pastor, and people always, some of the hardest conversations I had when I told people that speaking in tongues and your emotional experience is just emotion, and that's a gift from God. People just have a really hard time wrapping their heads around that. And I get it, but.
Guys, I see your comments coming in and some questions, and we'll get to some of those. But I do love that. I had a really great spiritual experience to a Tom Petty song one night, and I love that. And my daughter's in the theater arts space, and that creativity. So like the Lil Nas X thing comes out and everybody loses their fucking mind. Sorry, let me just let me throw in a curse word just to help us here. But and to me, I just think God looks at that and says, man, I love creativity. I love pushing boundaries. I love it. And that doesn't mean everything is profitable, but can we just take it for what it is and say, okay, let's be challenged and just appreciate the creativity of it all. And it may not be my thing, but it's still something creative, and God loves that creativity, I think.
Yeah, people miss out on the joy of life by being so critical of it all the time. And like for me, one of my favorite songs in this season of life has been Troye Sivan, gay pop artist, wrote a song called Heaven. One of the lyrics is, how can I get to heaven without changing a piece of me? Essentially his message is, if I need to change, maybe I don't want to go to heaven. And it's this thing that conservative Christians would, of course, react strongly to. But you've got to, if you understand the context, if you understand that this is Troye Sivan working out his own religious trauma, and there's something liberating and healing and deeply spiritual, and I would even say Christ-like, about this wrestling and this music, but just because it has some theology or perceived theology that doesn't align with your worldview, you miss out on it. And that's what Lil Nas X was doing. Like, it was a critique on anti-LGBT and purity culture. Maybe if we listen to that, our churches would be a little bit more effective. But instead, we just build a wall and cut it all out. So
ended up giving him a lot of publicity in the meantime, so, which I'm sure he was happy about. A question from Stephen is, how has your journey as a gay man, if that's an appropriate term for us to use, impacted your spirituality?
Yeah, I could talk about that for hours, but in one sense, I think the LGBT experience, I think the marginalized people period experience is like an spiritual evolution hyperdrive. The coming out process for most LGBT people puts you.
How old were you at that time?
I got outed when I was 21.
You were outed? Oh.
In Time magazine, of all places, because an evangelical publisher canceled a book deal, and it was a big fiasco.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. So mine isn't completely like the average story, but nonetheless, there's this death. There's a death to ego that happens in the coming out process, because there's this perceived sense of self, a false self that we've been projecting into the world, that in an instant has to go away. And usually there's rejection, and usually there is kind of what Jesus went through, kind of the beating and accosting and the mocking. And then there's a resurrection. And I feel like that process of coming out in my own life, and for most LGBT people I know, there's this spiritual maturation that happens that I feel like a lot of the straight folks that I've talked to said has come much later in life. And I think the experience of being in any marginalized group gives you a deeper insight to the heart of God, in some sense, because God is in the marginalized. Now, I don't think that I don't play into oppression Olympics, and I don't think if you're straight or white or a man that you don't have access to these things.
Right.
But I do think there are just these common experiences that the LGBT community goes with. This weekend, for instance, I'm going to New York Pride, and we will all gather around the Stonewall Inn. And there's this powerful moment where I'm with a community that has realized we've gone through this death together and we've risen together. And for me, it's so profoundly spiritual. And it changes the way I relate to others, because I'm willing now to listen and empathize with all sorts of people going through all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, I don't think I can understand the depths of those experiences and how they impact you.
And I hope it's okay to ask, but how old were you when you realized you were gay, and what was that process like, going through seminary and pastoring and all of those things? How did those all work together?
Yeah, so right after I got saved in my fundamentalist Baptist church when I was 12, I started having some sort of feeling towards the same gender, and I realized that there was no room for that in my worldview. And so I worked hard to suppress it. I dated a cheerleader for 2 years in high school. And my mindset was that if I could just get to Bible college, if I could just cross that threshold, actually begin becoming a pastor, God was going to deliver me from this. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Moody Bible Institute, expecting fully to get a wife within the 4 years that I was there. And there's a lot packed into those 4 years, but essentially, as I studied the Bible, as I interacted in the city of Chicago with all sorts of diverse people, my theology and reality kept clashing. And I always say, when theology and reality clash, it's your theology that needs to change. And so my own theology started being really shaken up. I did reparative therapy, conversion therapy. Mm-hmm. Nothing was changing. But what was happening was this inner sense of self-confidence that I knew who I was. As much as I tried to repress and deny it, I knew it couldn't happen. And that led me in 2014-15 to getting outed. And then for me, it was after being outed that I really reconciled faith and sexuality. But yeah, my journey is so similar to, I think, most LGBT Christians, of just long periods of repression and trying to align our best with what we are taught is God's will, only to find out that we've been sold a lie about what God desires and how impossible it is to live within these standards, because to do so is to deny God's own creation. And yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, for me, it was a matter of, I knew I didn't want to condemn a group of people to hell anymore. And I knew too many gay people who were some of the most amazing people I knew. But still was in this, but I know what the Bible says kind of thing, which we all know that those things are being heavily discussed now. But for me, again, I think you're right. My reality was like, I'm just going to love these people. And so for a while there, then my wife would say, but would you officiate a gay wedding? And I was like, no, because that would cost me my job, probably as much as anything. I would lose my job, as well as my reputation and everything else. But, now it's just, I grieve for the pain we caused. And some of our friends who came to our church have shared that pain, that, you said we could come and we would be accepted, and we were, but there was a line we couldn't cross, and you didn't tell us that. And so I just got sick of hurting people. And I said, well, I'll set my Bible beliefs aside and just love people and see what happens. So.
Yeah. And I just want to affirm your experience. Like, I've walked with so many pastors who have had their own coming out experience. I mean, this is a coming out experience for a lot of pastors to say, I know this is wrong. I mean, it's to give a parallel to what we talked about in the earlier part of this, like during the abolitionist period of history, you had theologians who were wrestling with Paul saying, slaves, submit to your masters, but they knew in their hearts this wasn't right. And at moments, I think those are the moments where the Spirit of God does their best work. Peter knew somewhere deep down, you can see by his own actions, that excluding Gentiles wasn't right. And he wrestles and wrestles until it becomes clear God's working in the Gentiles. God doesn't want us to enslave other humans. LGBT people are already Christians. So in those moments, I think a lot of pastors have to be bold and prophetic. And it costs. There is a death. You lose careers. Both you and I mean, in different ways. I gave up. I would have had much better selling books and much higher paying book deals and bigger churches. You would have your church, all if we didn't do what our hearts told us was the right thing to do, what the Spirit was telling us to do. And there's a cost for that. But that's exactly what Jesus promised would happen when we follow in the way of the Spirit. Yeah.
I'm much happier now, though. I'll tell you that for sure. So let me get to some of these questions. This is Charles from Chula Vista. He wants to know, which one of your books would you recommend people read first?
I'll say two, because if you just want to know kind of my spiritual journey, deconstruction, my first book, Nomad, A Spirituality for Traveling Light, kind of tells that story. And then if you're interested in the LGBT stuff, I wrote a theology book called The Gospel of Inclusion a few years ago, which outlines the redemptive hermeneutic trajectory I talked about earlier, and addresses the clobber passages and does all that fun stuff. So those two books are good entry points to either deconstruction or LGBT theology.
Very good. All right. Michelle in Idaho says, how much would you say your theology has evolved since getting on TikTok and dialoguing with people of all types of beliefs?
I think TikTok has radicalized me. The thing that I didn't expect, and I'm sure this is your experience too, I was not expecting the thousands of young conservative fundamentalists.
Oh, man.
And it breaks my heart. And I empathize with them because I was them. And I've kind of I now have a no bullshit policy. I'm just going to say what I think. And if it's true, if it's what I believe is true, I'm going to say it. I'm not going to bounce around. I'm not going to try to be polite. If it's offensive, I'm sorry. And so I would say I'm a more radical liberal, and I just want to say stuff now on TikTok. Whereas if you look at my very first videos, I was much more nuanced and balanced. There's just no way to be nuanced when people are saying, when 13-year-olds are saying the things that they're saying on your timeline. So anyway.
I actually had that experience where because I'm like you, I actually feel kind of badly about it, but I'm just done with it. And so I'm just in the face of any fundamentalist that gets on and starts, because I'm going to defend the marginalized now more than I care what those guys think about me. And I was going at somebody, and he finally said, well, big man coming after a 13-year-old like that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea you were 13.
But here's the thing, to our defense, like the one that I always go after, David Ladding, who I think is probably about 17 or 18, but he's got 1.5 million followers that are listening to what he's saying. So I think we have a responsibility to make sure that these young people at least know that there's a different theology that's not condemning them. And I kind of like the intergenerational dialogue. I think there's something powerful. So
sad thing about it is I had a group of college guys that were just bombing my page. And like, I reached out to some of them and said, hey, can we have a legit dialogue? And their response in the DMs was, absolutely. Thank you for being cool. And then they would stitch me and do really shitty stuff. And so finally I'm just like, nah, you guys are full of it. Forget it.
Yeah.
So I just call them Pharisees now. I don't have much time for it. Brian says, as the social justice gospel permeates with more and more ministers deconstructing, do you also see an increase of fundamental resistance? Yeah, that's kind of what you're talking about, but your thoughts on that question? Yeah,
totally. I mean, Robert Keck, who was a Methodist pastor, wrote a book called The Sacred Quest. And in it, he talks about the supernova effect. He predicted this, that a star burns brightest before it dies. And in any time of progress, there's always a reaction. That was the Trump presidency. If after 8 years of Obama, there's this massive reaction. I think, yes, we are seeing evangelicalism's last stand. I don't think conservative Christianity is gone. I think it's still going to be a dominant force in the world. But I do think that 50 years from now, Christianity will have overcome, Lord willing, this very far-right version that is dominating today. And we will see, Lord willing, an evangelicalism that looks like the original evangelicalism, which still has people that believe in the inerrant Bible and the virgin birth, all those things, but are open to dialogue and open to conversation. And I think in between that process happening, we're going to continue to see the battle lines drawn all the more starkly. And we just have to keep persevering through it all. So keep your heads up, everyone.
Yeah, I wonder how prevalent that right-wing youth rising up is, because my hope has been my kids' generation are going to fix this thing. You know, the boomers and Xers, we kind of lost it, and the millennials just aren't going to have it, and the Zers are going to fix it. But I don't know, how much do you think that sort of responsive right-wing kids is going to be a factor going forward?
Yeah, this is a whole nother super interesting conversation, because I don't think any of us, I certainly don't think about just the last 4 generations, realities have been fundamentally, completely, and totally different. My generation is the first. The internet was created right before I was born, and I've grown up never not knowing the internet. Generation before us didn't have that. The next generation not only has the internet, but they've had cell phones and social media and Google since they were born. And
Yep.
so I think that proliferation of information and global connectedness that this next generation has is the antidote to fundamentalism. Like, again, you can't hold a fundamentalist view of the Bible if you're just willing to do a basic Google search on some of the facts about that fundamentalists proclaim. And my hope is that this next generation, being born in this reality, this virtual information reality, just can't escape the fact that the information's there and is going to have a more nuanced approach, even if they end up being conservative. It's a more nuanced conservatism rather than this black and white, harsh theology that, not to be an elitist generationally, but it was born out of ignorance because there wasn't access to the kind of knowledge that people have access to today.
And that's true. And because there is a very conservative part of California. I live in it. Many of and we call them conservatives and right wingers, but then when they move to Idaho and Arizona and Texas, they start to turn it purple. So I think even that conservatism of some of the younger generation is different than the boomer conservatism.
Totally.
Interesting. All right. Michelle says, this is a response to your TikTok response to her question. She says, TikTok has made me a more radical liberal too, and I don't even make videos. That's funny.
Love it.
Sharon says, this new generation children being born now are called Gen Alpha. I think that's interesting. Yeah, you guys can do more questions in the comments if you like. Did I hear you say once that Richard Rohr was a mentor of yours?
Yeah, that was a crazy. My last 8 years of my spiritual journey, I found myself with some of these world-shaping people, and I don't know how or why. But for Richard, I've gone down and spent a couple days with him in New Mexico every year for the past 4 or 5 years, and it's those sorts of people, not like the gift of Richard Rohr and the gift of Phyllis Tickle and the gift of Brian McLaren is not their theology. It's that they live and act and look like Jesus when you see them. And I think Richard has shaped my theology in just his gentleness and his creativity, like that stuff. If I encourage all of you, if you've never looked at Rohr's stuff, to do it, you just sense in the reading of it that there's this Christ-likeness. And yeah, it's, for me, getting to hang out with some of these folks has been really transformative. Just, again, like you said, hanging out with the Bethel leaders versus hanging out with Richard Rohr, you can really see a stark difference. And it's not that hard to have discernment about who's actually following Jesus in those situations.
And those are such hard conversations because these are people that have radically impacted my life in a really positive way. And we one of the stories we like to tell is I don't know. Have you seen the Netflix series The Family?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, yeah. So we were introduced to Doug Coe. We were invited to go to the National Prayer Breakfast and ushered into this really weird hotel room to sit and like kiss the ring of Doug Coe. It was like one of the weirdest experiences of my entire life. Wow. But it, being in that sphere of politics and religion as our household did run us into a lot of people like that. And it has been beyond belief for us to see these people get so deep and corrupted in literally saying to us, you're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
You're going to go to hell for supporting pro-choice people and that, Christians are voting for Donald Trump. And it just is beyond belief that I could ever see leaders and mentors who I really loved and respected go that direction. I mean, how do you see that? How did that happen? Do you have any biblical explanation for that?
No, I mean, I think it's as old as sin is. I think you and I both probably have these experiences, and that's another podcast episode of like the weird places we've been. I before I came out, I was the young evangelical, and I was in rooms with the Bill Hybels and folks like that, and it was. And you're right. There's this uneasy feeling, and I feel like everyone has to feel this when they're in that space, where these people just don't realize that they truly have sold their soul under the guise of the gospel to power or affluence, and it's so evident. Like, I feel like if anybody in the public could peer into these spaces where most of these high-powered religious leaders in our country are gathering, you'll just see. I mean, it just, again, you have to be blind not to see that this is antithetical to everything Jesus was about. And I think again, Jesus says so much about losing your soul and gaining the world. It's the temptation in the story of Jesus' temptation when Satan takes him to the top of the temple and says, you can have all the kingdoms of the world. That's what Doug Coe, and I have so many mentors that love him, and I never met him, but it sounds like, and from that documentary, it looks like he was a man who started off genuine and was offered the kingdoms of the world. And he took the kingdoms of the world, and you can't save your soul when you do that. And once you're in that, Jesus says it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because once you're blinded by money and power and wealth, it's pretty much a permanent blindness. It's hard to get out of that. It's hard to give that up. And I think that's why we're seeing this great destruction of evangelical megachurches these days with scandals and X, Y, and Z, because these people are going to go to the very edge and jump off the end and watch their churches die because they're so intoxicated by power and wealth. And yeah, it's Jesus was right. So
yeah, and I think when Jesus said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, this is what he was talking about. It's that mix of all that hypocritical bondage of law on people while giving ourselves permission to execute people because that's what needs to happen so the Messiah can take over the government. And that's what God wants and so the leaven, Jesus said, would make you not have eyes to see or ears to hear. And I truly believe that's what we're seeing happen is people who really love God and have pursued Jesus so powerfully are now believing really crazy stuff. And and even Jeremiah 5 says the prophets prophesy falsely and the priests are leading out of what they say, and my people like it that way. I think that's evangelicalism in a nutshell today. So it's pretty crazy.
And just to comment real quick, just on that, because in talking about this, it can sound like we're in a silo, and I'm always very aware that it's like, well, the conservatives are the evil ones here, and the liberals. But I really do think, in my experience, I'm now in a very liberal world, and I'm just being authentic and thinking out loud here. And I get to be in some spaces now with very high-profile liberals. But the difference is liberal values. The disparate nature of it and our lack of ability to agree on anything and our commitment to justice, I feel like it prevents the same kind of corruption that exists in the conservative world where there is an orthodoxy and it is easy to create systems and power. And I'm just kind of thinking about questions that others might hear when they hear this about like, why is it so one side or the other? It's not that corruption doesn't exist on the left, but it's that the very openness of being progressive will make it much harder to actually solidify and hold on to power or amass wealth, because our movement, our worldview is always changing and evolving. And whereas the conservative worldview solidified in 1960 and has only radicalized, it hasn't loosened or changed in any major way. And anyways, so just thinking out loud there.
Yeah. That's interesting because I hear that a lot. Well, it's bad on both sides. And sort of my response always, but yeah, one side says it's God has commanded it and you're doing it for God and people will go to hell if they don't. And I don't hear that from the left. I can hear them say a lot of other cracky stuff, and be really unfair at times, and sometimes be more idealistic than realistic, and they hate the realistic. The really radical lefties hate Joe Biden because he's actually like, hey, what can we get done?
Yeah.
But I don't hear the left saying, if you don't do this, you're going to hell.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The left will critique the left. Very rarely do you hear the right critique the right. Whoever Trump is the right now. And if you critique him, you're Liz Cheney. You get kicked out. If you're on the left, AOC will critique Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden all day, and they'll still be part of the same parties. There's a difference in the way fundamentally they're posturing themselves. It's interesting.
So how do you see your mission now? What do you hope to accomplish in the next 5 to 10 years in your work?
Life changes so drastically. I can hardly even think about what I'll do tomorrow. But really, my goal right now is twofold: to create whatever it looks, whether it's a digital community or an actual faith community, for people to have the space to deconstruct safely, one that's not confined to a set of doctrines or beliefs, just to be able to create spaces or content that helps people do that. So I'm committed to that. And then I moved to DC and left pastoral ministry because I felt like my energy right now could best be used actually doing advocacy and actually engaging in the social and political transformation that I feel like Jesus calls us all to engage in. And so I hope to be able to, in the next 5 years, really straddle this space between the church world and the political and advocacy world, and continue to normalize the ability for Christians to be engaged in both, like so many great people before. So yeah, something like that.
Well, it's beautiful. And your just your content has had a big impact on me. And again, you were one of the first that showed up when I jumped on TikTok, which was a crazy thing for me. It was literally like, I'm done with Facebook. Those people are insane. I'm going to try TikTok. And so I just really appreciate you. I want you to know how and affirm what you're doing, and just let you know what a big impact you've had on our household, and just what that has meant to us. So I appreciate it. I love the brilliance that you bring to what you're doing, the solidness of understanding Bible and theology. Sometimes I feel like I'm kind of making this stuff up as I go. So it's very helpful to know there's somebody that's really studied this well and knows this stuff. And I can go, oh, okay, yeah, that's kind of like what I say. So just thank you. I just want you to know I really appreciate what you do.
I appreciate you saying that. And I really do appreciate you too, as well. Like we were talking at the very start, like this community of progressive clergy on TikTok, I feel like I don't know most of us, and yet I feel like we're truly in the trenches together. And I'm always encouraged to also hear folks say similar things and know that I'm not in this alone, or I'm not crazy. So thank you for your videos. Thanks for continuing to engage, and let's keep doing this stuff.
Yeah, I'd love to keep chatting from time to time, and however our household can walk with you, we're here. So I'd love to stay in touch.
For sure. Well, thank you so much.
All right. And our community hanging out, thank you guys for joining us. Appreciate you guys for being part of our Patreon community, and hope you've enjoyed meeting Rev Brandan today. And don't forget, it's AN at the end of that name. All right, Brandon, we'll talk to you again soon. Really appreciate your time, and be blessed and be well.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night. We'll see you.